Hey, Raymond here from the Beginner Photography Podcast, and skydiving is definitely on my bucket list. What's on your bucket list? Let me know. Send me a message on Instagram at rhatfieldphoto. Okay, let's get into today's interview.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast with Raymond Hatfield, the podcast dedicated to helping you grow your photography skills. Raymond interviews the world's top photographers in their field to ask questions that will get you taking better photos today. Now, with you as always, husband, father, home brewer, LA Dodger fan, and Indianapolis wedding photographer, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome back. It is me, Raymond Hatfield, your host of the Beginner Photography Podcast. And today we have an interview that I am incredibly excited for with a photographer who knows his stuff, and you're going to hear all about it in today's interview. But I wanted to share something real quick. As time goes on, the podcast becomes... okay, let me start over. When I first started the podcast, it was kind of self-serving, right? I really wanted to talk to other photographers and kind of pick their brains to find out how I could be better, right? Building this platform to let me do so was an awesome idea and was really exciting. But as time goes on, as each episode comes out, I realize more and more each day that these episodes are not only incredibly useful to me, right? And let me pick the brains of some of the world's best photographers, but it's important for you, the listeners. And sometimes it takes reading, but not getting face-to-face, but meeting people online, right? Joining the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group to really hear people's stories about listening to the podcast that makes me realize that this podcast is just way bigger than what I started this thing for. And I think it's best kind of summed up in today's iTunes review, and it comes from Magda, and she's in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group. So Magda, first of all, I just want to thank you for leaving an iTunes review. And what Magda says was, I stumbled upon the podcast a couple months ago, and I have to say it's been life-changing. I've always loved photography, but listening to Raymond in his interviews has inspired me to learn and keep shooting. He has such great energy and puts so much into each episode. I highly recommend listening. If you're looking to learn how to take better pictures, you will not be disappointed. So kind of a lot of that was about me, right? And I feel weird about that because I'm just here kind of asking the questions, right? It's not me who's sharing the information. It's the guests who share the information. But what Magda's getting out of it is the information is changing the way that she's shooting. She's been interested in photography for a long time, right? But it wasn't until kind of listening to other photographers that she decided to pursue it further, right? And that is what is kind of shifting her life in a new direction. And I love hearing that just from this podcast episode, right? Well, maybe not specifically this one because she hasn't heard it yet, but she will hear in a few minutes, and I'm sure that it'll have the same effect. But it's just really awesome to hear that other people are having experiences with the podcast that are more than just very passively listening, that people are taking action, listening to this podcast and putting their life, like they're taking control of their life and putting it into motion of where they want to go. And that is just so awesome. So Magda, thank you again so much for leaving that review on iTunes. And I'm glad that this podcast in some way affects your life to move it in the direction that you wanted to. So thank you again. All of these iTunes reviews, I cannot tell you how much they mean to not only me, but to you. For every podcast, for every review that the podcast gets, algorithms and stuff, it increases the visibility in iTunes. More people find the podcast, which increases our visibility to potential guests as well. The larger the podcast, the more guests will come on and share their information. So if you would take 1 minute of your time, I would be so incredibly grateful to leave the podcast a quick review and be honest about it. If it's not 5 stars, if it's only 3 stars, I want to hear. Let me know. How can I make the show better for you? Leave a review. Let me know your experiences. And again, thank you. Thank you so much for everything. Okay, we are going to get into today's interview right now. This interview is with landscape photographer Andy Mumford. All right. And Andy, you may have heard of him. He posts a lot of educational videos on YouTube all about landscape photography. And it is today's interview is just one that I'm really really excited to get into. But as always, there's a good chunk of the interview missing that is just for premium members. And today, premium members are going to hear things that are more along the business side of shooting and specifically landscape photography. So today, Andy talks about things like the importance of an Instagram following and how he built his organically. He talks about the basics of selling your work on stock sites, knowing that an image will be sold affects how the image is shot, and how to even price prints when getting started. So there's a lot of information here for premium members. And if you are interested in becoming a premium member, just head over to beginnerphotographypodcast.com and you will see a premium membership link up at the top. Just click that for more information. So that is it. All right. We're going to get into this interview, but before we do, I want you to check out the show notes of this episode just to see a sample of Andy's work so that you can get some context behind some of the things that we're talking about. So if you're listening in a podcast player, you should be able to swipe up. There should be a link there to the show notes, which should be something like beginnerphotographypodcast.com/podcast/137. And then that will take you to the some examples of Andy's work, and you'll be able to see it there. One thing that really struck me by surprise, maybe it shouldn't be by surprise, but it was how down to earth Andy is in this interview. Here's this guy who you see him, and he's essentially living the dream of so many photographers. He gets to travel the world. He gets to go to beautiful locations, and he gets to shoot the things that he wants to shoot on his own terms, right? Sure, maybe he has to get up at like 3 or 4 in the morning to go on these long hikes, but you get the idea. Is that he gets to do these things that he wants to do and shoot the things that he wants to the way that he wants to. And you're going to hear in this interview just how incredibly down to earth Andy is and how he doesn't overcomplicate his approach. And it is just incredibly refreshing. And I know that you are going to get a lot out of this interview with Andy. So without taking up any more of your time, let's go ahead and get on into this interview right now with Andy Mumford. Today's guest is a landscape photographer based in Lisbon, Portugal. He is also an author and posts his adventures on his YouTube channel, where he shares extremely helpful tips on becoming a better landscape photographer. He is also the latest in an ever-growing list of Fuji Ambassadors to join the podcast. Today, I am excited to be chatting with Andy Mumford. Andy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. So like we kind of said right there before I started recording, at the beginning of the year, what I decided to do was I reached out to the members of the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group. And I simply wanted to know, like, who are the photographers that you want to hear from? Who are the photographers who have an influence on you and you just have questions about that you want to expand your knowledge of photography? And your name came up more than once. And I knew right then that, like, oh, this is a perfect excuse to reach out to not only another Fuji photographer, but just somebody with an incredible portfolio. So today I'm really excited to be chatting with you.
Well, thank you. That's really nice to hear, and it's quite surprising to hear, because I think quite often when you're doing photography, you and you're doing YouTube, you get the comments, but you do still feel that you're also almost operating in isolation. So when you get that kind of feedback that people want to hear what you've got to say, it still comes as a little bit of as a surprise to me, but it's quite nice to hear.
Yeah.
So hopefully I won't let people down.
Yeah, no, no, not at all, not at all. But as a podcast host, I can parrot the same thing. It's I talk to these people, I talk to you, I talk to other photographers, and there is this weird, like, is anybody listening to this? Like, I don't know. The numbers say that there are, but I have no idea. So that's why the group really comes in handy. So. I mentioned that you are a landscape photographer. You do just beautiful work when it comes to landscapes.
Thank you.
But I'm sure that one day you didn't wake up and you're just like, okay, here I am. I'm a photographer. Let's get going. Let's do some workshops. I want to know how you got your start in photography in the first place.
It's a long story because it's been quite a long journey. I came to photography quite late. I kind of discovered Photography. Well, when I was a kid, I always had like a film camera and I was always documenting what me and my friends were doing when I was sort of 17, 18, 19. But that doesn't really count in terms of photography as a passion that defined a lot of aspects of my life. That came about 15 years ago when digital photography was just taking off and I got my first digital camera. And I went to New York actually and took a lot of really bad photos and just came back thinking, these photos look nothing like my experience. So I got really interested in learning about how to take images, how to take better images, because until that point, I'd only ever thought of just pointing my camera at stuff and clicking the shutter. I had no idea of any of the aspects of photography, of what a camera was actually doing. So I started to learn and I started to post my images online in places like Flickr and DeviantArt, if you remember that community.
Oh, I do, yeah.
And started to pick up tips. I just found particular DeviantArt was a really helpful community for people sharing experiences and sharing learning experiences and stuff like that. So I started to learn, and what I always loved was photographing landscapes, because I'd always, as a kid, I'd been used to go camping in Switzerland and France, and really loved being outside and really loved being in nature. And I lived at that time really close to the sea. So the obvious thing for me was to take photographs of the sea. And I kind of really fell in love with that whole act of being outside with a camera. And it just enhanced the experience of being in nature. It really kind of focused it. So I kind of started with that and just learning how to take better pictures of the sea and learning about filters and about the different aspects of exposure and the different and long exposures and things like this. And it was just a hobby which grew and grew and grew. And then it started to shape trips that I would make. So I've always traveled a lot. So I would start to make trips. Instead of going this place because I thought it looked cool, I went to this particular place because I thought it had great landscapes. So my travel started to revolve around going to particular places that I wanted to photograph. And then the professional side came in from a complete left field. And I think happens to a lot of people who take photographs. At some point, someone says to them, I'm getting married and you take photos. Can you photograph my wedding? So it was a completely different thing to anything that I was doing. But I photographed a friend's wedding and then another friend's, and then through a long series of coincidences, drifted into doing wedding photography professionally. I started to advertise because I had other friends who were doing other things connected with weddings, and started to shoot more and more weddings. And that was when I really started to learn about professionalism and dealing with clients and having deadlines and photography as more than a hobby. And that grew and grew, but alongside of that, I was always fascinated by travel photography and landscape photography, and I was still doing trips and learn and improving my portfolio and trying to improve my skills in landscape photography. And so they were kind of both growing side by side. And then at a point about 5 or 6 years ago, a little more, people started to ask, I get emails, I'm coming to Portugal, could I do a day with you and you could take me out shooting and we could do maybe a workshop. So I started doing one-to-one workshops, which grew to group workshops. And then to where I am now. It wasn't a plan, and there wasn't a time when I thought I'm a photographer, I'm not a photographer. I just kind of drifted into it. And alongside all of this, at the time when I discovered photography, I was teaching English. That's how I came to live in Portugal. And what happened was as I started to make a living I started to make earnings from doing wedding photography, I became part-time teaching. So I was doing part-time teaching, part-time photography. And photography just kind of grew and grew to fill in the gaps until I eventually left my job and just became a full-time photographer. But because it happened so gradually, there wasn't ever really a plan. I never had this, right, I'm here now, I want to be there next year. It's just like things happened and I reacted to them. And then, here we are.
Wow, that sounds like a very non-American way of getting to where you are. I think here in America, you would try to plan out everything to the T, and then if one thing didn't work, you would just give up on it all and and get upset about it. But I love that kind of philosophy that you had, and I want to know. There was a few questions out of that. The first one being, when you started shooting weddings, did it feel wronged you? You kind of mentioned the importance of the professionalism aspect of it. Was that against the grain of what you wanted out of photography?
Um, that's a good question. I never really felt it. At the beginning, I didn't feel of it that way because there's a responsibility with shooting weddings. I think wedding photography is probably one of the toughest areas of professional photography to work in because every single shoot that you do, you're working on the most important day in someone's life. They've put sometimes a year's worth of planning into this day, and they've chosen you to document that, to be the person who helps provide their memories. Because what happens, I think, I'm going very off topic here, but what happens quite often with memory and photography is sometimes our memories anchor themselves around, when the memories start to fade a little bit, our memories kind of sometimes anchor themselves around particular images. So in 10 years' time, a lot of the images that you take from someone's wedding are going to be quite instrumental to their memories of that wedding. I think, they're not the only thing, but they are very important. So I think there's a great responsibility that comes with wedding photography, which I probably wasn't aware of when my friend asked me to do it, because it was very much, oh yeah, don't worry, just take some pictures. And then it increased in professionalism. The next person, I was like, okay, I'm going to do this better. So I invested in a flash and things like that. And I never really thought, oh, this is going against against the grain. It was just, I don't know. I like learning stuff, and I like to try to do things well. And so for me, it was a kind of like, how do I do this? How do I do this well? How do I do this better? It did reach a point in wedding photography where I think wedding photography, on the one side of it, is an incredibly positive thing, because a wedding is one of the days in life when you're genuinely surrounded by positivity. There's a lot of love in the room of any wedding, and that's really nice. Everyone is just generally having fun and enjoying themselves, and it's nice to work in that environment. It's nice to be working in such a positive environment and to be part of that. And I did enjoy that, but I reached a point where I just didn't love it anymore. It was becoming a mechanical process, which wasn't what I wanted out of photography. What I want out of photography is it's quite selfish. There's an element of self-satisfaction I don't really like to use the word communicating, because I think that's presumptuous, but I think certainly in landscape photography, you go to a place and you have an experience, and you're trying to capture and define that experience in an image. And I wasn't really getting that from wedding photography. There's a huge amount of creative possibilities. And I see a lot of wedding photographers doing really creative stuff that I'm just like, oh, wow, that's incredible. But it wasn't really working for me. I don't know. I didn't really, I just kind of fell out of love with it, I guess, because of the pressure of, you go to a wedding, you shoot 3,000 images over sometimes a 14-hour period, and it's exhausting. By the end of the wedding, you're exhausted. I used to shoot with a Nikon D3, which is a big pro body camera with a 70 to 200 f2.8 lens, which is a really big, heavy zoom lens.
Very heavy,
and an SB 900 flash. And I'm sorry, I don't know American weights, but that's coming in at over 3 kilos in European money. And by the end of it, just the strains on your arms, your fingers, and on your whole body. And then you get back and you've got these 3,000 images to cull and edit down to the selection that you give to the client. And I really believed with weddings that there's a very strict time limit, because people have their honeymoon, and generally after their honeymoon they go back to work and their lives start to go back to normality, and the wedding recedes into the past. So it was really important to me that the clients would get their photos within 3 weeks from the wedding, which if you shoot sort of 3 weddings in a month, you're kind of setting yourself up for 12-hour days of editing to try to get the client. And I just, because of that, I just stopped loving it. And it wasn't what had pulled me into photography in the first place, which was generally, as I was saying early on, sitting next to the sea, taking my time, photographing waves, waiting for nice sunsets or good light, and that just kind of drifted away, and I stopped being in love with wedding photography.
That makes sense. I love that approach. I love that inside view into your brain there. It was very refreshing to hear. So thank you. So when you went from, I want to know more about that trip to New York. You went to New York. You took photos. You got back,
Hmm.
and you're like, "This is not what I experienced at all." Was there a lack of technical understanding in photography, or was it composition, or explain to me?
Oh, it was everything. They were
It
terrible.
was everything.
um, well, as I said at the beginning, when I was a kid, I used to have a film camera, and I would take pictures. When I was basically always the guy when me and my group of mates had parties, I would be the one with the camera, because obviously this is in the late '80s, early '90s. When we didn't have phone cameras and stuff like this, so I was
Yeah.
always the guy with like a small pocket film camera who was documenting that. And you take the pictures to Boots the chemist and get them developed, and then there'd always be the photograph. And the phrase that we had in my family was, "Oh, that one hasn't come out well." Like a picture was badly. It just it didn't it developed. It was overexposed or whatever. And I never really questioned that phrase. My feeling was that you pointed the camera at something and the camera faithfully recorded it. And that, if they didn't come out well, it was just this kind of mystical thing, chemical uh, process that hadn't worked. So when I came back from New York, a lot of my photographs didn't come out well. And what that meant was that they didn't show the scene in the way that I remembered it or what I was experiencing at the time. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of those were exposure reasons, because, for example, I was shooting into bright light, and the thing that I was shooting just silhouetted out because the
Hmm.
camera exposed for the, exposes, overexposed, underexposed. Um, or I hadn't got a photographer's vision, so I'd see something that I thought looked really great, like the Chrysler building, which I think is just an astonishing building, or the Flatiron building. And I go, okay, this is beautiful, I'm going to take a photograph of it. And then when I looked at the photograph, I saw all the things in the photograph that my eyes hadn't seen at the time. Things like, on one side, lots of construction work going on, and there's a big litter bin in the middle. And these were the kind of things that, as a beginner photographer, I'd just seen the scene, thought, oh, great, I'll point my camera at it and it will be the same. And then when you see the image, what tends to happen is that we're much more critical. And the things that our eyes edit out in real life, we don't see that ugly litter bin, we don't see that construction works, become really apparent in photos. And certainly when you show them to other people. So it was a mixture of those kind of things, of just not being aware of composing and arranging elements within an image, and not having an understanding of the the way that exposure worked. The camera was going to underexpose in particular situations, overexpose. It was, the shutter speed wasn't fast enough to freeze movement, so there were things that were blurring and things like that. And I just had no understanding of any aspects of that. So those are the things that I thought, well, how can I make this better? Those are the things that I wanted to learn.
So how did you educate yourself on what you needed to learn, and how'd you do it? What resources did you use?
I used the internet a lot. I bought quite a few books on from Amazon on the different aspects of photography. I think the first photography book I ever bought was a Dorling Kindersley book. It was like the guide to everything photography, and it's a book now that I look at it and just think, God, why did I ever buy this? But it was incredibly useful, because for every page, or every 5 pages, which were just like, no, that's not interesting, there was always something that was like, oh, of course. Literally, things like moving litter bins out of your
Yeah.
image, which seems so utterly obvious now, but at the time they really weren't. And as I say, I started posting images on sites like Flickr and DeviantArt, and I would ask people. I would see people who were taking images that I wanted to take, and say, you said you used a filter here. What's the filter? Why did you use that? What does that do for you?
Mhm.
And occasionally people were very, very helpful, and I learned a lot just from asking people online. And I do get a lot of questions through the YouTube channel now, and I do try to answer everything, because I know how useful it was for me when I was starting out learning. Because there are so many things that so many aspects that we really need to learn, and I think with every person it's different. Some people would naturally pick up some things very easily, and some without even needing to ask, and other people don't, and other people get other things different more easily. So I just asked a lot of questions, basically, and I read a lot. And I
So
practiced a
just
lot.
just a pure curiosity and putting it into practice. That's great.
Hmm.
I think when it comes to learning photography, oftentimes new photographers are either looking for just like one source. You know what I mean? Like, where's the one place that will just teach me everything about photography? And like you mentioned there at the end, it's like everybody learns kind of in a different way, and
Hmm.
everybody has a different way of understanding what it is that they're doing, and that there isn't just one source for every photographer, and you kind of have to
Mm.
be a little bit self aware and do it yourself.
Well, I spent before as I said before I was doing photography full time, I was a teacher, and I was teaching English for, I don't know, almost 20 years of my life. It's a long time in the classroom. And during that time, I spent a lot of time learning about learner acquisition and the way that that we have different learning styles and the way that people learn in different ways. Some people learn orally, some people learn visually, some people learn kinesthetically. And everyone has a different way of learning and has a different speed of learning. And from teaching, you would know that if you had a class of 15 people and you would teach, you'd do an hour-long class on a particular aspect of the English language, that almost everyone would remember something different from that class. You know, the next week, one person would have completely forgotten this thing, but remember those words, where the other person didn't remember those words, but they'd remember this grammatical item that you taught. So I learned a lot about learning from being a teacher and from the way that people learn. And I think it's a really important thing to remember when you're what I do now is a lot of photo education through workshops, is to, just because you tell somebody something, it doesn't mean that they're going to learn it. Everyone needs has a different way of gaining information and of acquiring knowledge.
That's a very awesome inside look into photography. Because while I was listening to that, I thought I'm definitely the one who wouldn't remember anything from like an hour long conversation. That's why I'm glad that we get to record these so that I can always go back and listen to them. When it comes to wedding photography, like you mentioned, as a former wedding photographer, um, I know that for me, my main goal when I'm shooting a wedding is to capture the emotion, and things like composition and even exposure can even go by the wayside a little bit, because if I get a
Hmm.
photo with like, an amazing emotion where the moment matters most, then it's okay. I can get that.
Hmm.
So that's what I focus on. When it comes to landscape photography, what is your main focus and goal to capture in a frame?
I think it's always about mood and feeling. So it might not even be that different. I think, as landscape photographers, we tend to want to shoot in particular light, when the light is at its best, because it makes a place more appealing. But ultimately, all of these things are secondary to the mood. When you go to a particularly amazing place, whether it's a mountain or a forest or whatever, or some particularly beautiful piece of coast, there's a mood to being there. I think landscape has an energy, and I tend to say this a lot in videos, so I apologize if I'm repeating it, but I really believe that as human beings, we are really at home in nature, because I think that for most of our existence as humanity, we actually had a much closer relationship with nature than we do now.
Mhm.
But I believe it's still there in all of us, and I think that's why. Where I live in Lisbon, I live very close to the sea, and on any given day, if you drive out to the beach, you'll find people who drive their cars out and sit and watch the sunset. Now, why do we do that? What is it that attracts us in America? You have national parks. What is it that pulls people to those national parks in the weekends and their holidays? And I believe it's, we generally do feel good when we're in a wild place. And I think landscape photography is, you're really attempting to capture that feeling, not so much the place, but the feeling that the place gives you. So that when people see the image, they feel something of what you are feeling. So that's kind of always the goal. So it is, as you're saying about wedding photography, you're trying to capture the emotion. It is very similar, but the way of the ways that emotion works in weddings is obviously very different to the way that emotions work in a natural environment. But yeah, I think fundamentally you're looking at what's happening with the landscape and what's happening with the weather, how the mountains interacting with the clouds, for example, and thinking, okay, what's my experience here, and how can my image show that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. But when it comes to landscape photography, if you walk away from a day with like one good image, like it's a great day, you have to be a lot
Yes.
more critical with your work than you do with weddings, I think. So, what sorts of things are you looking for in a great image?
Well, first of all, there's the technical aspects. So
Yeah, I'm sorry. I
focus,
guess yeah.
correct
Let's
exposure.
focus on the technical aspect.
So there's focus primarily because I think you can get away at a wedding if you've got a fantastic moment, and like someone spinning around on a dance floor looking into each other's eyes, and you don't quite nail the focus. I think you can get away with that in a wedding.
100%. Yeah,
But with a landscape, if it's not in focus, so that's
throw it away.
primarily the first thing. Then obviously exposure, not having the shadows too dark or the highlights too bright, because if you've got a really bright part of the sky, the eye is naturally going to be pulled to that. It's not something that we can hide. So if you've ever exposed a bright bit of the sky where the sun is, we're naturally going to do that. And I found as a beginner photographer, that was one of the things that I would do. I would point my camera at the sunset, and obviously then you look at it, there's a big blown out highlight, which just doesn't look nice on a photograph. So there's those technical aspects. And then in terms of composition, I'm a big believer in balance and harmony, and the way that different elements within an image react to one another or relate to one another. And it's almost as though when you're looking at a landscape, you're defining it down to various objects. So there's, this mountain is an object, and this rock in the foreground is an object, and you're trying to understand how much weight those things have in a composition. So some things will be heavier in a composition than others. And trying to work out so everything feels that it's balanced, so there's not too many heavy things on one side of the image, because that makes it feel like it's tilting one way. So if you've got a cliff on one side and a rock on the same side of the image, then that image is going to feel lopsided. So it's the arrangement of the different elements of the landscape within the composition and how they balance and relate to each other. So I still, that's still for me a technical aspect. And then there's the mood, and the way that the mood is captured is to do, first of all, the technical aspects are a part of that. Because sometimes if it's a really heavy stormy day, you might want to underexpose a little bit, because you really want to bring out that feeling of the dark clouds and the storm. So you may make the technical decision to underexpose the image a little bit. And then also the way that you process that image, which just in subtle ways, like moving the white balance in something like Lightroom just a little bit, is going to give the image a very different tone or mood, whether you cool it or whether you increase the temperature, make it a little bit warmer. So there are all of those things that go into the thought process of trying to create an image that really captures what it was that I was feeling at the time.
That makes sense. That was a good overview of what to get started with when it comes to landscape photography, or at least where to start researching for sure. It seems like I kind of want to switch gears here for a second. It seems like in recent years, Instagram accounts with the most amount of followers seem to either have one of two things. It's either hot girls or landscape photos. Two very seemingly different things. How important has having a strong Instagram presence been for you?
You're listening to the free version of the Beginner Photography Podcast. Do you love what today's guest is sharing and want to hear the full interview? Become a premium member. You will also gain access to the huge back catalog of past interviews. Get monthly in-depth photography training videos and great downloads. Sign up today at patreon.com/Beginner Photography Podcast, or click the link on our website, beginnerphotographypodcast.com. Thank you for your support.
There you go. Okay, so this kind of wraps the whole thing up. right here. And this
Okay.
question is from Sean in the group. He is also a fellow Fuji photographer. He's the one who recommended me like most, reached out to me and was like, "Look, you got to get Andy on the podcast." His question is now just as a background, he is a full time, I believe, like software developer. Or he works with computers, and like in the mornings before work, he'll hike up like a 20-mile mountain to like take a beautiful like landscape photo, and then like go to work. Okay, like this guy is dedicated to what he does.
Hmm.
And his question is from your experience seeing other landscape photographers, do you think that landscape photographers will be able to make a living sufficiently? And what are some baby steps that he can take to become full time?
I think that there is the world that we live in today. That it seems very. I don't think I've ever done an interview where I've spoken so much about the business side of it. I think that there is a bigger market for selling a process than a product. And I think that YouTube and workshops and blogs and even things like this podcast are an example of that. Because there are so many people taking great images, trying to make a living from the product, from prints, from licensing is very, very challenging. If you're having to pay your mortgage and your food, and your living costs, and you've got kids and things like that, you have to be to put it in very blunt, uncreative terms, you have to be shifting an awful amount of units, which can seem daunting, and which was for a long while the reason why I didn't consider landscape photography as a career, because it was much easier to sell the product of a wedding session, for example. What I found works for me and what fits in with my previous career is the market for the process, which is selling the experience of workshops, or YouTube, which through YouTube advertising and through affiliate links and through sponsorships generates a revenue more successfully than selling prints. There is a very, to sell prints, if you have a name, if you're Art Wolf or someone like that, then you're going to be able to sell your prints at a very, you can still make a significant income from doing that. But for most of us, that's really not an option. And most, I think, landscape photographers in this day and age, in what year is it, 2019, with the way that social media is so prevalent, it's a far more realistic goal to look at using those tools as a way of building a photography business, using things like YouTube, advertising, because YouTube advertising generates an income. Affiliate links generate an income. Then when your channel reaches a certain level, then companies want to talk to you about sponsorships, which generates an income. And that in turn then brings your work to a large amount of people, which makes it easier for you to sell prints, but also to do things like workshops, which is what I enjoy doing the most. So I would say, if you want to make a living, if you're trying to transition careers from whatever you're doing to landscape photography, is to look at how you go about sharing, because I think there's such a huge appetite for that. People want to share, they want to share people's learning experience. So even the idea of documenting your attempt to become, your process of becoming a professional photographer is in itself something which is valid to other people who are trying to make that step themselves. So, for Sean, I would say try doing something like this, because the fact that he's asking this question, obviously there are a lot of people who want to do the same thing. I transitioned from my full-time job through wedding photography to doing landscape photography. And I think people, there are people who possibly would like to try to do the same thing. So that in itself is something that has value. That process has value because people can learn from it. And there are all kinds of, people online, you see people selling courses online or ebooks and these kind of things, because that's where fundamentally the photography market is heading now. I think experience is what people enjoy more than product. So when I'm doing a workshop, people will spend quite large amounts of money to travel to particular places, to go to shoot places, to learn photography, to be in an environment where they have where they're surrounded by, where they're only doing photography. And those same people won't necessarily make the same investment in a print, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It goes back to what you were saying earlier. Like, we feel at home in nature. There's something in nature that we enjoy, and part of it is now the experience, right? The experience of
Mm-hmm.
going on a workshop is much more valuable than having a print and kind of sitting at it and imagining what it took to get that photo. So I absolutely get that, and I think that Sean can definitely take away from that answer. So thank you. Um, you talk a lot about on YouTube about the importance of failure, right? Can you
Yes.
share a personal failure that you faced while shooting landscape photography and how it affected you?
Um, I don't know. Yeah, it's not. There are just so many stories rather than one in particular. It's you very often, just I was in Norway a few weeks ago, and you can very often shoot something and you get so involved in the process of being there that you then come back and you look at the images and you think, if I'd stood a meter to the right. So I think it's rather than being disheartened from that, it's the kind of, okay, next time I need to be more aware. I've had so many, uh, and I think every professional photographer fails more than they succeed. I think I think that's true in any level of creativity. Every writer or every songwriter, produces more songs than they ever record, and has more versions that don't work out than the versions that eventually make it onto, to be recorded. And I think that every one of those is a learning process, which makes the one that works. It's what makes it work. But in terms of stories, I remember years ago I went to Scotland, to the Isle of Skye, and I really wanted to photograph the Old Man of Storr, which is it's a very famous rock formation on the Isle of Skye, and it's a sunrise location because it faces east, and it's a bit of a hike. I can't remember exactly, but it's about an hour to walk up there, and it's generally quite a steep incline. And I set off at about 4 a.m. in the dark on my own, and it was a bit miserable. It was wet and damp and raining.
This place you've
And by
never
the
been
time
to.
I'd gone up there the previous
Oh,
afternoon
okay.
to scope out the scene, and then I sat there, and when the sun never came up because basically the cloud cover was so low that I couldn't see more than, I don't know, like 20 feet in front of my face,
Oh no.
and I never even got to see. I couldn't even see it, and I just sat there, just thinking, why am I doing this? It was freezing cold. It was raining. What is the point of doing this? And then I, it's very easy to get disheartened and just think, well, this was a complete waste of time. But then the next day you think it's to get up and you think, well, tomorrow will be better. So I'm going to get up and I'm going to do it again. So then the next day I got up, I get sunrise and got a great shot, not from the Old Man of Storr. I went to another location and got a shot that I was really happy with. But I don't think that really gets to the point of failure, what I was saying of learning from failure. I think it's just understanding that when you shoot something, you will often not get it quite right. I think, sometimes you do, but occasionally it takes a few attempts, and those attempts can happen within the same shoot. So you can be shooting something and then you realize, maybe if I go and stand over there and remove this rock from the composition, and that requires a level of awareness that what you're doing isn't working. And sometimes, you can stubbornly stick at something, and I've done this before. I think, no, this is going to work. This is going to work, and then I look back at the images, and I just think, no, what was I doing? It clearly didn't work. And then understanding that the reason that it didn't work is because that things weren't balancing. The elements weren't balancing within the frame, and that quite simply that there wasn't a shot there. There wasn't, what I was trying to do just was never going to work unless I'd moved somewhere else. And I think it's just understanding that and realizing that it doesn't matter if you fail and you understand that you failed, then you'll go and do it again, and you will learn from the failure. Hopefully, you'll learn that maybe you needed to compose it better. But beyond all of that, and this is what I think is most important, is the fact that it's just great to be there. Doing photography, and I think it's very easy to lose this, is, when you get to a beautiful place, you can feel that if you haven't taken an image that captures that you failed, that there was no, but you haven't failed, you've gone to an amazing place. Actually, I've just remembered a very good example. The first time I tried to shoot the aurora, I failed completely, because when you shoot the aurora, the northern lights, usually you're in the pitch black and you can't see anything. So focusing the camera is a challenge. So if you're trying to shoot the aurora over a mountain, you usually can't see the mountain, so you're focusing blind. So what I made the mistake of doing was just setting the focus ring on the camera to infinity and thinking that'll be okay.
Should work.
But it's not, because most lenses are set up that when you shoot them at infinity, they're actually not set to infinity. You kind of have to go back a little bit. So shooting at infinity really gives you. Shooting it where the lens tells you is at infinity really gives you front to back sharpness. So pretty much all of the images that I shot of the aurora were a little bit out of focus. And there's initially this disappointment, God, it didn't work, damn. But I had a brilliant time. And this was what was most important, is that you can't let the photos or the lack of success in getting the photo define the experience, because being out there shooting the aurora is a privilege. It's a gift. I was so lucky to be able to do that, and it was such a pleasure to be standing in this place with this incredible light show going overhead. That in itself was a fantastic experience. And then there's the taking away the fact that it didn't work and thinking, okay, next time I'm going to get it right. Now, it would have been nice to have got it right the very first time. And I would have got images from it. But the reality is that, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, often, these things don't matter, because we don't need to have a great image of every single great experience that we have in life. That's not what makes life worth living. That's not what makes going out to shoot the landscapes important. What makes it important is going out there and being there and using the camera as a way of connecting with that experience, because I do find that shooting the landscape actually focuses you on the experience. It really, for me at least, it really enhances it. And if the image doesn't quite work out, then the experience is still an incredible one. And hopefully the next time I'll get it better. But I know that as I go through photography, I'll still make mistakes. We still have a joke now that occasionally, the last time I was in Norway recently, I went out my first two aurora shots, the first one aurora shot, I forgot to take the lens cap off.
Oh,
and it sounds ridiculous,
Andy.
but because it's so dark and you can't see anything, it's like, oh, right. Yeah. And then, everyone still does that thing where they, you're shooting at night, so you have the ISO set at 3200, and then you go out the next sunrise and you're shooting the sunrise, and you've left the ISO at ISO high. And these things, I know that I don't do them very often anymore. I mean, it would make me sound incredibly incompetent. I think my competence has increased significantly, but there will still be mistakes. And I know that every professional photographer, because I partner with different people in workshops and stuff like that, still does these same things. Everyone does them, and no one gets it right and gets it perfect every time, all the time. And I think that's the thing to remember as a learner, is that, everyone is making mistakes and is continuing to make mistakes and is learning from those mistakes.
There was a lot to unpack there. That
Sorry.
That was great. That was very motivational. I loved hearing that, and it doesn't just take one bad trip to kind of ruin everything. One thing that I think about a lot, one experience that really moved me, growing up was a middle school field trip that we took. It was like a week. I think it was a week long, and we went to Yosemite National Park, and it was just transformative. Being there, seeing, just trying to take it all in. It was absolutely beautiful. And when I was in, I guess it was like 7th grade, I didn't have a camera really to take with me to take photos. But I think about that sometimes. Have you ever been in a situation where you get to a location, maybe you planned it out, and you get there and the light is good, and you just don't feel, not inspired, that's not the right word. You just don't feel like taking a photo in that moment. You feel like you just don't feel motivated to take that shot. Does that ever happen?
I think it happens sometimes in different ways. It happens sometimes when I know that the place itself is beautiful, but that I can't necessarily find a way of making it work photographically, because
There you go.
there's perhaps not a focal point. There's not something to build an image around. Not every great view makes a great photo. Yosemite, though, I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's
So what do you
different.
do in those situations where you show up and you're like, the light is beautiful?
Well, I think, I usually take a photograph, but I won't spend a lot of time preoccupying myself with it, because if it doesn't work, and I'm very lucky because I do this for a living, and I know usually I'll get another opportunity and then I'll get another chance. And I don't worry. Linked to what I was saying too much earlier about failure, I don't worry too much about always having to have an image, because I know that the next day, or that I'll do it, that there's always going to be another opportunity. So sometimes, if you just think, well, this isn't going to work, there's not anything I can make work here, but it's an amazing place, then it's just fine just to let it go. It's not really a question of not being motivated. It's just understanding what works, what's going to work photographically and what isn't. A few years ago, I was in northern Chile. My wife and I, we kind of did this road trip from the north of Chile across Bolivia, across the Altiplano. And we spent about 4 days in the north of Chile getting acclimatized, because the crossing, we were going to do it in 4x4s, is regulated about 4,500 to 5,000 meters. So what's that? That's between 12 and 15,000 feet, I think.
Oh my goodness.
So we needed to be acclimatized. So we spent about four or 5 days just kind of at a village called San Pedro de Atacama, getting acclimatized and just making these trips up every day, gradually higher and higher. And on one of those trips, we kind of went out into the Altiplano, which is it's a very high plain, which runs all the way down the Andes Mountains, go through a huge part of South America,
Yes.
like the Rockies in North America, and it's basically, I think it may even be the same. It's like a long chain that's the spine of the continent. And the Altiplano is a particularly high part of it. And in this part of South America, it's very volcanic. So there's a lot of extinct volcanoes there in the north of Chile and the south of Bolivia. And we were traveling back, and very high, at about 12, 13,000 feet. And on the western horizon, it was really low, because it was at the edge of the mountain range, and really heavy cloud. And I could see that the sun was going to drop below the clouds and was going to paint. There was going to be a really, really good light, and it was going to really give a lot of color to the scene. But I didn't expect what happened. The whole sky just erupted in color. It was bright red. There's incredible light. And my wife and I just stopped and got out of the Jeep. And I looked around, and my first instinct was to take a photograph. And I took a photograph, but it was just scrub. We were in the middle of just there wasn't much that I could look around to make things work. And so I took a couple of images, but more than anything, I just remember my wife was just laughing, because she's going, this is absolutely amazing. And at that moment, taking a photograph didn't seem that important. It was such a unique thing. And looking around and thinking, I can't really make a great image here. The sky, the light's amazing, but it's just, I know that there's nothing, maybe, that speaks of a lack of skills in photography. Maybe another photographer could have done. And I could have scampered around and lost that moment and not come up with it and gone away with nothing. What I did was just do a quick shot, which just recorded the moment and captured the light and the color. But mostly I just enjoyed it and just took in what was happening, and just, like my wife, just laughed, because it was just an incredible scene with with the sky and clouds and the light. The mountains went red. I've never seen mountains go red before. They were painted bright red, and it was just an amazing moment, which is not. Yeah, I look back on it now and think, could I have done better? Could I have made an image work? And what I find when I think about it is that maybe I could have done, but I don't really mind. I don't really mind
Yeah.
that much, because it was,
Yeah.
I was there and I saw it. And the reason that I saw it was because I went to that place to take photos. So photography still gave me that gift. It gave me that gift of being there. And in the end, the image or the lack of image, it doesn't matter, because there's always going to be another
Doesn't
chance
matter.
somewhere else.
You know what I love about that story is that while you were telling it, I had this big smile on my face, and like I could imagine it in front of me, even without having seen even just this documented image of it. I have an idea of what it is, and I think that speaks volumes to the power of telling a story. So, excuse me. Thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem.
You have shared so much today, Andy. You really have. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. I got one last question for you.
Okay.
If you had to go back and start all over again, what would you tell yourself to better prepare to be where you are today?
I'd have probably found a composition beforehand for that place that I just talked about. What would I tell myself? I don't know. Things change. The world, the environment that we live in changes, and the way that things were then is not how things are now.
Okay, so then let me reframe. What
Yeah,
advice would
okay.
you give to somebody starting out?
Starting out now is very different to how it was, and what I would advise someone is to just shoot all the time. Expect the things that I've talked about before. Expect to fail. Practice. If you can't get to, I'm very fortunate because I can travel, but if you can't get to beautiful places, there's always something that you can find. When I started shooting, it was at a beach that was just down the road from where I lived, and it wasn't a particularly good-looking beach, but you can find a way of making it work, and you kind of refine your craft by doing things. Learning your technique. And the most important thing is to do things that you love and that you enjoy. If you're doing things and you're thinking, well, I'm going to do this because this will be popular, that's not the right reason. If you're doing it because you love doing it, then that will always serve you better in the long term. And also just to not be afraid to look at what other people are doing and ask them, what are you doing? I think, we all imitate to a certain, not imitate, but we're influenced. We can't help but be influenced by people, and to not be afraid of that, not be afraid of being influenced by people, but then putting your own twist on things, finding out what you like doing, and just I don't, it's like my career in photography came about, as I've said, through a series of different things happening that weren't particularly planned. So I don't really feel that I can give advice about this. These are the steps that you need to take to be successful. And I think I would be wary of anyone who says that, because I think everyone has a different path. When I started out in DeviantArt, a number of the people that were my contemporaries are also making a living from professional landscape photography, but each one has followed a slightly different path, has done things in a slightly different way, because there isn't just one path. So, and what works for one person doesn't work for everyone. So I think that what it comes down to is about, it's such a cliche to say being true to yourself, but doing the things that you enjoy and enjoy, I'm just repeating myself there. And not trying to do things just for the sake of this will be popular, this will be successful, because I think that in the end you won't enjoy it as much, and there's no point. And I think if you're not enjoying it, you won't be giving yourself fully to it, and then you won't be successful. You can't be successful doing something that you're not fully committed to doing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I can't imagine ending this in any better way, for sure. That was very motivational to me.
Thank
And
you.
I know that it will be to the listeners as well. So again, Andy, thank you so much for coming on.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course, for the listeners who haven't been able to follow you yet, can you share where's the best place to find you and your work online?
Well, my website, www.andymumford.com, is where my galleries and workshops and where the best of what I do is, and where everything that I do basically ends up there. So my best images, my blogs and films that I make, but also through the social media channel, through my YouTube channel, and through my Instagram, Andy Mumford Photography.
Perfect. And of course, I will have links to all of that in the show notes. And for some reason, my Alexa just went off. So let's turn off the microphone. That was creepy. And again, Andy, thank you so much for coming on. And I look forward to keeping up with you in the future.
It's been great. Thanks for having me.
My biggest takeaway from this episode was that you don't have to feel like you have to make something work. Sometimes you can just truly enjoy your experience. And that, if that is not refreshing to you, I don't know what would be. Because how many times have you shown up to a location and either something wasn't working, the light wasn't working, you just couldn't get the right composition. It just wasn't flowing the way that you had imagined, especially when you built that. Like, if this is a guy who's traveling the world to go to a location that he's only at for like a day or two. And he said, like, if it doesn't work, just enjoy your experience, right? He's got the most amount of weight on him to make something work. And he just gave you the green light to enjoy yourself, right? So that was definitely my biggest takeaway from this episode, because it's not a very American way of thinking about things, right? Here in America, we're kind of taught to, always think about doing things faster or growing larger or being the best. And that's all without, looking at ourselves, we should always strive for the best. Yeah, okay, I get that. But you still need to be true to yourself and figure out what it is that you want out of photography. And that, like Andy said in his interview, it's all about balance and harmony. And I thought that was just so insightful, and I really took a lot away from that. Trying to make a photo that works, that also fits, the way that you want to shoot. Those are two things, balance and harmony right there. And Andy, I just want to say, if you're listening right now, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast, sharing everything that you did. I learned a ton from talking to you, and I know that the listeners did as well. So again, Andy, thank you for everything. So guys, we're just going to wrap up this interview right now. Again, if you were so kind, I would so appreciate just leaving a quick iTunes review or a review in whatever podcast player you are listening to right now. It really does help out the podcast. And again, I would be incredibly, incredibly grateful for your time in doing that. So guys, that is it for this week. Until next week, I want you to get out there. I want you to keep shooting. And I want you to focus on yourself. Like always, that is the theme of 2019. Focus on yourself, all right? So that's it. Be safe. Keep shooting. I'll see you next week. Love y'all.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please leave us a review in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. And continue the conversation with Raymond and other listeners of the podcast by joining the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group today. Thank you. We'll see you again next week.